everyone, to this session. Welcome to our friends joining us online. We're glad that you're able to join us here. I'm happy to introduce Gillian Warson. Gillian comes to us from the UK. Gillian has degrees in music and theology, has written a number of books, including most recently, Using Vintage Hymns in Worship, Hidden Treasures Rediscovered for Today's Church. And copies of this, I believe, are available in the bookstore. So you're welcome to pick one of those up if you like. I first met Gillian probably 5 years ago at the HSGBI conference in the UK, and I know this is going to be a wonderful session. So will you join me in welcoming Gillian Warson?
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining me, and thank you very much to the 24 people who are joining online. So thank you. It's lovely to see you. I'm very happy about that. So in my section, we're going to be doing a little bit of singing. I'm going to go through with some images in a sort of talking fashion. It's going to be a bit of a talk. And then there'll be time at the end for a lively discussion. So I say I'll go through. If you have any questions, please save them to the end, and we'll do them then. So I've called this Singing for a New Jerusalem. Where can we find a New Jerusalem? And can I have the first image, please? It's not very clear, is it? Perhaps we can find it in a world free from sin, where there's no suffering, no poverty, no inequality. According to William Blake, a New Jerusalem is a land fit for a visitation from Jesus himself. Part of a longer poem published in 1804, the two verses we now recognise as the hymn Jerusalem have long been used as a rallying call to the English troops in the First World War, as the unofficial anthem for the Women's Institute, and as a popular choice for weddings and funerals. Set against the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution, the text draws on strong images of a beautiful countryside ravaged by the dark satanic mills of the poem. The verses end with a call to action and a promise that the reader, or in our case the singer, will not sleep until a New Jerusalem is built in England's green and pleasant lands. And with that in mind, we're going to sing Jerusalem, and I know that we'll get a nice rallying call from our English singers. I think you all know the tune if you're not so familiar with the words, so take it away, Ben. Oh, sorry, next slide.
Was
dancing. Creating such a land, well, I enjoyed it anyway. Creating such a land is certainly an ideal, but is it really possible to work towards this in our hymn singing? Andy Thomas, in his excellent book, Resounding Body, which we've got up on the screen, and I'm delighted to say this is also available in the bookshop, so you might want to add them as a pair. He writes that singers might offer a vision of community grounded in love and concern for others, where social, racial, and gender differences are made irrelevant, where all are included in the worshipping life of the church and all are supported. This is exactly what we're working towards, but in order to achieve this, we need to think carefully about how we choose and sing our texts and how we retain or discard them. Perhaps we should start by asking how appropriate these hymns are to our worship. The idea of being appropriate in a hymn has two aspects, a negative aspect and a positive aspect. In its negative aspect, an appropriate hymn encourages harmful attitudes such as jingoism and paternalistic missionary activity. It excludes or fails to include, consciously or unconsciously, sections of the population such as women, disabled people, or other marginalised groups. In its positive aspect, an appropriate hymn inspires us to goodness. This may involve a deeper understanding of God, either directly or through an understanding of God through his creation. There may also be a social element, doing good to the immediate or wider community through acts of charity, care for the environment, and so on. Naturally, this way of thinking could be applied to any action in our day-to-day lives. We want our words and our deeds to do good and not harm, and therefore we are counselled to watch our tongues. In fact, the 9th step of humility in the Rule of Benedict warns that we control our tongues and remain silent, not speaking unless asked a question, for Scripture warns, in a flood of words you will avoid singing. A talkative person goes about aimlessly on earth, as in Psalm 140:12. Can we have a next slide, please? So careful thought should inform our hymn singing to ensure that we are working towards a perfect world. Is Jerusalem, that text that we've just sung then, an appropriate hymn? It is true that it's loved by many in England, but is that enough? There are hymns, such as Jerusalem, which in England at least, many people of a certain age learned at school and then carried into their adult lives, where they continue to enjoy singing it at weddings, baptisms and funerals. In my own family, indeed, Jerusalem was sung at my mother's funeral and my son's wedding. Already, we've been lured into a trap. We may be tempted to sing these familiar words without reflecting properly on them. Rarely sung in England, save for these special occasions, Jerusalem is now most famous for being included in the popular second half of the last night of the proms. Here, together with texts of an unashamedly nationalistic stamp, it is enjoyed by the flag-waving masses for whom any unease is quickly swept away by the desire to have a good time. Can we have the next slide, please? That's the Albert Hall there. Is this an appropriate use of the hymn? Those who find the words uncomfortable suggest that the England of the text could perhaps refer to the British Empire with its sometimes unpalatable past. Sung in these circumstances, Jerusalem joins Rule Britannia as just another patriotic text, naively trumpeting England as superior to all other nations. Naive but harmless, some might say. But this may be enough to misdirect our thinking. If Jerusalem is such an inappropriate text, why continue to sing it? Could it be that, even with its nationalistic overtones, sung with thought, it may serve to advance the work of Christ on earth? Blake sets out a vision of a land free of inequality, and indeed a new Jerusalem suitable for a visitation from the Son of God himself. When considered from this point of view, it seems completely appropriate that it should be been adopted in 1918 by the women's suffrage movement. Even today, the hymn remains the unofficial anthem of the Women's Institute. Can I have the next image, please? Although this movement in England is sometimes ridiculed, it is an organisation which lobbies for positive change in society, and perhaps through its unobtrusive activities is playing a part in realising Blake's vision of the green and pleasant land. Could it be that through singing this hymn, we might find that the solution to some of the world's current problems may lie within ourselves, rather than in political and technological fixes? For many women, the pace of change is slow and the trajectory not always forward. But perhaps, just perhaps, the singing of Jerusalem by the WI may assist the ultimate vision of equality. Blake's poem, now very much a vintage hymn, can certainly fuel our imagination, and through the power of his vision, his work has the capacity to stir us to action. Recently, I was involved in tutoring on a course with my friend and colleague, Janet Wotton. It was called Worship Shaping Mission, Shaping Worship, except that we could never remember the order of the words. Does worship shape mission, or does mission shape worship? At a basic level, singing together, whether hymns or any other songs, is a unique experience and can help express a collective response to all manner of situations. From protest songs speaking out against injustice and hatred to the chanting of a football crowd, the power of collective singing can stir up emotions. In our hymn singing, as we've seen with Jerusalem, the blend of text and tunes means that when we sing a hymn, there's an opportunity not only to think about what the words mean, but also to feel the force of the words, as conveyed by the music. This goes some way to explain the power that hymns have to influence, for good or evil, our conduct and attitudes. Hymns are written to influence us in different ways. They can aid direct meditation on God and can help our thinking and feeling about God by exploring the wonders of his creation. Other hymns may tell stories from which we can learn moral truths. However, these descriptions fail to capture one crucial feature of hymn singing, and that is the power to affect our actions. Of course, any song could fulfill this function, but it's hymns with their potent marriage of text and tune that also allow unique power to move us. And perhaps Jerusalem is such a hymn. In his short guide, number 1, What's the Point of Singing Hymns, published by the Hymn Society of Great Britain and Ireland, Martin Leckerbusch reminds us of the dialogue that emerges between the singer and the text. We may start to ask ourselves questions such as, do I really believe this? Is this what I actually want to do? In our daily lives, we naturally focus on our own concerns, but a hymn can open us to new ideas and new visions which reinvigorate our social conscience and stiffen our resolve. Thus, a hymn may nudge us out of our comfort zone to reshape our thinking and spur us to action. Generally, hymns are sung within the context of religious worship. Of course, this is not the only time that hymns are sung, but it's not unusual for people to remark that it is the hymn singing that makes going to church at best pleasurable, or at least bearable. What a shame. Hymn singing is not something that's set apart from everyday, but rather a golden opportunity to look beyond the everyday, to a glimpse at least of the promise of solutions and resolutions. In this sense, hymn singing can enable us to be instruments of God. For the mystic Hildegard of Bingen, can I have an image, please? Singing reveals the hiddenness of God. She compares herself to a trumpet which, when correctly blown, sounds a note of living brightness. Singing hymns, then, is not just music making, but an offering of self in which we can articulate our hopes and our fears, no matter what our cultural background or personal circumstances. Hymns, then, are a powerful tool and can influence us, and so they need to be treated with caution, whether they're our favourite hymns or new ones freshly downloaded from the internet. But singing without thought has its dangers and can cause unintended consequences. It's easy to be swept along by a rousing tune only to realise on reflection that we do not fully subscribe to the sentiments expressed in the words. Scarcely the right approach to worship. Whether our hymns are old or new, we need to guard against two dangerous attitudes. The first is that unreflecting performance might lead us to espousing unacceptable ideas or attitudes to which we don't really approve. Equally great, though, is the danger that we might sing words that do express acceptable ideas and attitudes, but we don't give them the full thought they deserve. Thus, we miss an opportunity to deepen our faith or indeed put these ideas into action in our Christian lives. One reason why thoughtlessness might have crept into our hymn singing is that we fail to pay sufficient attention when we actually choose the hymns that we're going to use in our services. I wonder why this might be. The first excuse is that we simply might feel that the chore of choosing weekly hymns does not deserve full care and attention. A second may be that we fall prey to mechanical adherence to tradition. This might cover the ceremonial aspects of our chosen place of worship, or embrace the style of ritual we consider essential to maintain the status quo, such as traditions of customs, dress, bells and candles, for example. Can I have the next slide, please? Of course, we want to choose hymns that meet the requirements of the liturgy, but there's more to this than working through a list of suitable hymns as suggested by various hymn-choosing resources. Do we, though, still insist on selecting our favourite hymns, those we and our congregations know best? Why does this happen? Perhaps the organist will only play from a certain book. Maybe the congregation will complain if we don't have hymns they recognise. And what about not having a choir to lead new material? It seems to me that if we're going to take singing for a New Jerusalem seriously, then we need to think about how we can choose appropriate hymns, even if our predilection is to choose our favourites. Before that, here's something else to think about. We have all felt the abiding comfort of singing a well-loved vintage hymn. But hold on, why should hymn singing be comforting at all? Some people may say that singing familiar hymns is exactly the wrong way to respond to the Christian message. Surely a genuine act of worship should lead us to fresh thought, they urge, and not endlessly repeating ourselves. Such an observation raises fundamental questions about the form of Christian worship. However, we'll leave this debate for another occasion, or perhaps at the end of this session. Now let's turn our minds to some of the reasons why our actual hymn choices may be unacceptable. If we want to sing for a New Jerusalem, there are many reasons why a given hymn may not be appropriate, and I'll briefly mention a few. Many English hymns, especially those written in the Victorian era, are linked to the British Empire. Historically, Britons have been called upon by hymn writers to lead pious lives to ensure that they are worthy of the honour and power bestowed on them. Joseph Rudyard Kipling, can I have the next image please, for example, was an English journalist, short story writer, poet and novelist. He is most famous for writing The Jungle Book and the inspirational poem If. But he also wrote several hymns which were extremely popular at the beginning of the 20th century. In these, he offers strict instructions about how we, the British people, should behave towards our unfortunate brothers and sisters. In God of our fathers known of old, there is a stern warning that any loss of self-control would result in behaviour typical of, quote, definitely quote, not me, lesser breeds. Clearly, many singers today would find this dismissive attitude to other races both absurd and offensive. Mercifully, this text has not been included in any hymn book since 1960. Such hymns as these, with their strong association of the empire, leave hymn singers, especially those with a soft spot for Victorian texts, in a quandary. We find ourselves torn in two directions. Do we keep this hymn for its beauty of language and because of the reputation of the writer, or do we reject it on the grounds of its assumption of national superiority? Closely allied to hymns glorifying the empire are those which encourage conversion and missionary zeal. Again, especially popular during the Victorian era. Of course, the subject of missionary work is extremely complex, and there's plenty to be said, both for and against. Some of our hymns, however, reveal a troubling attitude to the past. I find it interesting that even at a local level, hymn writers use their craft to express a strong desire to convert those of other faiths. By way of example, I'd like to introduce you to Reverend John Watts. Can I have the next slide, please? Who was rector at the town where I live, Bicester in Oxfordshire, for 38 years from 1844. He compiled a hymn book to use with his own congregation, and as well as including texts by other writers, added a number of his own. One aspect of ministry close to Watts's heart was evangelism, especially, and troubling for us today, the conversion of the Jews. We know that he presided over an annual meeting dedicated to this cause, and in his collection he includes William Shrubsole's rousing "Arm of the Lord, awake, awake," especially as, again I quote, a prayer for the Jews, Turks, infidels and heretics. Obviously, this is a clear example of a hymn that we would certainly not be happy to sing today. Can I have the next slide, please? Arise, great God, and let thy grace shed its glad beam on Jacob's race. Restore the long-lost scattered band, and wake to joy each grateful heart, while Israel's rescued tribes in thee their bliss and full salvation see. Certainly, this hymn and others like it could not be considered to be welcoming the Son of God, especially when one remembers that it's unlikely that Jesus Christ would pass the strict residency requirements to live in the United Kingdom today. If our desire is truly to make the world a fit place for the Lamb of God, then surely a good place to start is with the language in our hymns. To take just one example, much has been written in recent years concerning the practice of using largely male gender pronouns in our hymns. As we wonder whether Jerusalem is an appropriate text or not, it's worth mentioning that there is not a single male-specific pronoun in the entire two verses. Yet the terms sons, brothers, and brethren continue to proliferate in our hymns. As these pronouns are intended to refer to groups that certainly contain women, such a practice is highly objectionable to women. Certainly, there have been many attempts to correct gender bias in some older hymns, but this does not always lead to the improvement intended. James Philip Macaulay's older text, for example, after a unison refrain, opens with the line, "Men are the sons of God and therefore brothers." It's been variously rewritten with some very odd results. The original appeared in "with one voice," yet in Baptist Praise and Worship, the fault is compounded as the line is improved to "we are all sons of God, sister and brother." Mercifully, in hymns and psalms, the line appears as "sisters and brothers, we are as God's children." Hooray. That includes us then. This question of adjusting the language of hymn texts raises an important issue for congregational singing in England. Hymn books themselves are durable, and the hymns they contain can be sung by the purchasing community without the need for further financial outlay. The huge burden of furnishing a whole group with individual books is not undertaken lightly, and it's not at all unusual to find churches and schools that have not replaced their regular volume for many years, sometimes 30 to 50 years. The chief drawback of using the same hymn book for many years is the inevitable conservative nature of any collection, and the fact that some of the hymn texts may, with the passing of time, express ideas, opinions, and attitudes to which the current singers are no longer willing to subscribe. Of course, once a text appears in a printed hymn book in whatever form the publisher thinks fit, it is fixed and immutable for future generations. Some excuses can be made for continuing to sing outdated versions of older texts. However, it never ceases to amaze me that questionable language continues to blight the hymns of even our most recent praise writers. It's unusual to attend a typical service in England which does not include a hymn for Stuart Townend, whose hymns and songs are considered to be fine examples of contemporary praise. Yet, in "The King of Love is My Delight," written in the late 1990s, we find the lines, "The price is paid for sinful man, accepted child, forgiven son." Surely some careful thought could have avoided these unfortunate references. Yet the hymn appears in 12 hymn books, including one particular book which is used in a very, very high percentage of churches in England, that is to say, Mission Praise. My point is that whilst there is a difficulty and highly charged discussion regarding changing older texts, there is little excuse for continuing to write such lines. If we're going to create a green and pleasant land fit for Jesus, then it's but a small step to the matter of conserving the planet's limited resources, which are being eroded through human action. Can our hymn singing help us respond to this emergency? A vital part of this is being able to perceive our environment in all its infinite detail and wonderful variety. And we need to possess a wealth of vocabulary. Sadly, there has been a trend to eradicate certain words from our language, even among those editing a much-used British children's dictionary. Part of education is acquiring such a rich vocabulary, and this applies to adults and children alike. For without words, we can have no perception. By impoverishing our vocabulary, however, especially the vocabulary of children who are of an age to be more receptive to fresh impressions, we undermine our ability to attain a true appreciation of nature. In 2017, author Robert Macfarlane drew attention to the fact that certain words in nature are simply disappearing through lack of use. He writes, "Once upon a time, words began to vanish from the language of children. They disappeared so quietly that at first almost no one noticed. In his beautiful book, The Lost Words, can I have another image, please? Exquisitely illustrated by Jackie Morris, Macfarlane recovers some of these lost words, words that are familiar to adults, such as heron, bluebell, and kingfisher, and brings them back to life with a vibrancy of colour and language. Singing hymns is one way we can keep these lost words in our vocabulary. In All Things Bright and Beautiful, for example, Mrs. Alexander reminds us of the glowing colours which surround us, and, I fear, if our attention is no longer drawn to them, we might cease to notice them. We can see the palette of our hymnody becoming grey as we discard other hymns, including I Love God's Tiny Creatures by George Wallace Briggs, which gives us the visually brilliant coral-coated ladybird alongside a tactile awareness of the velvet humming bee. Can we have that, those words up, please? I love God's tiny creatures that wander wild and free, the coral-coated ladybird, the velvet humming bee, shy little flowers in hedge and dike that hide themselves away. God paints them, though they are so small. God paints them bright and gay. Does anybody know that in America? Yes, I know you know it, Janet. Another text which emphasizes the light and colour of the natural world is Daisies are our silver. Can I have that text up, please? Daisies are our silver, buttercups are gold. This is all the treasure we can have or hold. Raindrops are our diamonds, and the morning dew, while for shining sapphires weave the speedwell blue. And this lovely hymn, I couldn't give you this because I didn't have the copyright for them. It ends with the lines, God who made the speedwell, keep us true to you. And I remember singing that when I was really little, about 7, and it was just so lovely. And I still think of that when I go out. Daisies are our silver. It uses this imagery of jewellery and wealth. If the drive to root out unfamiliar words continue, there is a danger that children may come to lack the necessary tools to develop a truer appreciation of nature and will grow up caring nothing for the natural world. Would it not be terrible if Bunty Newport's dystopian hymn, Think of a World Without Any Flowers, actually came true? And I'd like to sing this hymn. Oh. Can I have the slide, please? There's 3 verses, so it's going to come on to a different one. I can never resist when I sing adding the short story which is not connected to this, that I was looking at it once with my husband in the room, my husband who I've been married to for 38 years, and he looked at him and he said, "Oh, my piano teacher wrote that." So that was an amazing family connection. It turns out that Bunty Newport, who wrote it, was actually his mum's, my mother-in-law's, best friend. I didn't know that. Without a doubt, hymn singing is one tool that can help draw attention to things of vital importance that we might be in danger for losing. As we appreciate the wonders of nature and are spurred to preserve it, our realisation that we are dependent on the world around us is sharpened. The ritual enjoyed by many English schools and parish churches of the Harvest Festival, can I have the next image, please, with its association of hymns, serves to remind us of our dependence on the fruits of the earth. This annual celebration of God as creator has long been marked by the singing of specific hymns such as "We Plough the Fields and Scatter," translated from the German by J. Montgomery Campbell. This favourite harvest hymn shows God as artist, creator and provider. Full of sumptuous vocabulary, it's a hymn which cannot fail to lift the hearts, yet the words, "We plough the fields and scatter," are all too often dismissed as old-fashioned. Actually, when we sing it, it's a golden opportunity to keep in mind the threefold relationship between humanity, nature, and God. But I hear you say the world is changing, and I concur. There are few people in the West who are not touched by the innovation which has made both our lives more simple and more complicated. Just as we've seen the need for the right vocabulary to perceive accurately our natural world, we also need words in order to grasp the rapid change in this technological world. This pace of change has proved problematic for our hymn writers. Even a text that we might regard as modern may become outmoded and thus deemed no longer appropriate. The difficulty that we have here, however, is that if texts featuring outmoded references are discarded out of hand, then we're in danger of failing to take notice of the social and environmental problems to which they refer and still plague us. One interesting example is "Milk Bottle Tops and Paper Bags" by Peggy Blakely. This is a children's hymn which confronts the scourge of littering. Can I have my nice litter image, please? I don't know whether you have that in America, of driving round and finding whole piles of stuff by the road. It appears in this hymn, "Milk Bottle Tops," appears in only 2 hymn books and is now rarely sung, but we're going to sing it now. Can I have the words? Milk bottle top. Sorry, am I in now? Sorry, I didn't know.
Oh,
How many bars introduction?
4 bars.
4 bars,
Yeah.
okay.
Is that tempo okay?
Yeah, that's perfect. Milk bottle top. Sorry, I'm still wrong. Milk bottle tops and paper bags, iron bits, steady old rags, litter on the pavement, paper in the park. Is this what we really want to see? No, no, no. Oh, they simple chocolate wrappings, engine oil, rubbish in the gutter, junk on the beach. Really want to see? No, no, no. One more slide. Help us, Lord, to find each way, ways to keep the people away, that litter of the pavement, that rubbish on the beach. For this what we really want to see. Yes, yes, yes. So that's one. That's a real 70s one. Could this relative neglect result from the fact that glass milk bottles were delivered to almost every household in Britain for decades and they're now largely a thing of the past? The foil tops could be seen as rubbish and sadly on our pavements all over the country. Litter and especially fly tipping is a blight on our countryside towns now more than ever. Are we not now in the need of a hymn like this to alert us to this terrible damage that is being done by some thoughtless people to our countryside? The dark satanic mills of Jerusalem presents a vivid image of a changing industrial landscape, an image not often encountered in our hymns. Do we not prefer to be reminded of beautiful scenes of rural idyll? Yet our hymns need to embrace technological innovation, and with the speed of change, it's difficult to keep up. Richard Jones's God of Concrete, God of Steel is a rare example of a hymn which calls on images drawn from industry. And can I have God of Concrete, God of Steel up, please? Okay. Can we have the next slide, please? As we've sung that hymn, we realise that the true theme is not fast-changing technological advance, but a reminder that as creator, God is constant. Or as Percy Dermer puts it in his paraphrase of Goethe's text, everything changes but God changes not. Perhaps there's a suspicion that if we allow ourselves to sing seemingly dated hymns, we are betraying an inability to make sense of the modern world. However, I would argue that social ills do not vanish just because the reference in a hymn is regarded out of date. The inequalities Fred Kahn wrote about in Sing We a Song of High Revolt in the 1960s are just, sadly, as widespread today, even though the council flats have, in Britain, been taken over by housing associations or in private ownership. If texts such as these are discarded out of hand, we are in danger of forgetting what we so need to remember. Perhaps it would be better to continue to sing hymns such as these, despite their obscure references, if only to remind us of problems which plague us to this very day, which of course we take. We need to keep these urgent concerns in our hearts and minds. If we are to use our hymns as a tool for action, then we need to ensure that they are inclusive. We have already touched briefly on gender bias in our hymns, and I'll leave that argument to others. Instead, I'd like to think about hymns can stand up as a joint expression of action. Many hymns, of course, are written in the first person, such as "Take my life and let it be," and "Just as I am," without one plea. These hymns serve as a private expression of faith. However, when these very same hymns are sung in a congregation, they acquire a different resonance. The hymn "Abide with me, fast falls the eventide" is a popular choice for evening services and for funerals. However, when sung in a group, it emerges not just as a text that begs for guidance in dark times, but challenges us to help others. Like the school day classic, "When I Needed a Neighbour," it gives the oppressed and forgotten people a voice. Of course, it cannot be claimed that hymn singing can solve all the world's problems, but perhaps by working towards inclusive worship, we can move towards a new Jerusalem. This is where practical considerations take on a fresh importance. Our choice of hymns needs to be appropriate to the occasion, but also needs to speak to those who consider themselves outside or on the fringes of community. If we're singing for action, then we must include those of other faiths or no faith. Fred Kahn did just this towards the end of his hymn rising career, as his thinking on multi-faith hymnody evolved. A vivid example of this is "Hands Shaped Like a Cradle," which started life as "Put Peace into Each Other's Hands," one of the winning entries in the 1988 BBC Songs of Praise hymn writing competition. The central image of the original hymn is the vital part our hands play in the Christian Eucharist as they support a burning candle, are joined in prayer, and cradle the communion bread. In 1991, this hymn was sung at the first service of Thanksgiving for the life and work of a hospice in the north of England. Although the hymn was popular, the hospice chaplaincy realised that more and more Muslim and Hindu relatives attended these services. A reflection of the area's increasing ethnic diversity, and this was a reflection of the area's increasingly ethnic diversity. Clearly, these members of the community might hesitate to join in words such as, can we have another slide, please? As at communion, shape your hands into a weighted cradle, the gift of Christ, receive, revere, united round the table. Even though the anniversary services were held in a church, they were not intended to be exclusively Christian in their message. Eventually, Kahn wrote 2 new verses more appropriate for a multi-faith occasion, and we're going to sing those 2 verses now, please. Singing for a new Jerusalem means using our hymns to bring about wholesome change in society to make it fit for Jesus. But can our hymns as they are effect change in the wider world beyond the church doors? Could it be that their range that the range of influence is restricted to those who attend church? The answer to this is a resounding no. The influence of hymns is much more far-reaching than we might expect because their vitality allows them to flourish even in the world of the popular. So if we want to sing for a New Jerusalem, we must welcome all and exclude none. In other words, we must welcome diversity. If we wish to fulfill this general aspiration, surely a good place to begin as we welcome people to church. Extending a warm welcome presents challenges of its own because it requires genuine understanding. Diversity has its own diversity, and we must be sensitive to that. It can be difficult, especially if there does not appear to be any diversity, as so often happens in English towns. It's a very sad state of affairs when diversity appears to mean those who are wearing a long necktie and those who are wearing a bow tie. However, if we want to welcome a diverse congregation, should not our hymns appeal to the widest possible range of potential church members? One rector I've worked with refused to have any foreign language hymns on the grounds that she would not be able to understand them, and neither would her congregation. Even the ideas of a newly arrived curate from South Africa fell on deaf ears. Could it be the paucity of foreign language hymns in our books in England? Certainly the list is small in the mainstream books, and those that do contain more foreign language hymns are considered to be rogue. Taizé chants and shorter hymns published by the Wild Goose Resource Group make guest appearances, but often at a special service of some kind. Not surprisingly, then, that the congregation of many churches do not grow, even though there are undoubtedly increasing diversity within our towns. Could it be that the unwelcoming attitude of our government to our foreign sisters and brothers has contaminated the thinking of our ministers and congregations? There must be a solution to this, and perhaps one area to consider is the role which the musical director, worship leader, or choir director might play in church. Of course, as part of the body of Christ, we want to offer our best in praise and worship, but it's all too easy to get sidetracked by the quality of performance. Whether a choir or instrumental group is producing a perfect and well-rehearsed rendering of a given hymn bears little relationship to whether this same hymn is helping or hindering the process of singing for a New Jerusalem. One reason for this is that frequently the choir or music group is entirely separate from the living, breathing work of the church, and the responsibility for choosing hymns is vested in one more concerned with musical resources than Christian action. One day in my church, when the music group was unable to be present for reasons I cannot now remember, the question was asked, "Aren't we having worship this morning?" Worship, even in its broadest sense, is often understood to refer to the ritual activity that takes place in church, usually on a Sunday. Sometimes it's understood to refer merely to the singing bit of the ritual. However, we see now that this interpretation is too narrow, and we certainly heard that this morning. As we aspire to sing for a New Jerusalem, it is surely the case that worship is something that should encompass our whole lives, and not just the short hour when we're in the church pew. Hymn writers have addressed how we take the good news out into the world. Just as we welcome all to our worship, surely we should carry our voices out into the community. And as we heard this morning about bringing our worship into the church with our ritual, I want to now think about how we take it out, and end with Fred Kahn's beautiful text, "Now let us from this table rise." Now let us from this table rise, think we've got, I'm not quite sure what time we finish. Is it 1:15? We finish at 1:30. 1:15. Okay, so we've got a quarter of an hour to raise any points that you would like to contribute. You can either ask as a question or as a... Yes? Oh, sorry, can you... Yeah. And we might have... I'll repeat the question then. Voices found, no. Am I familiar? So the question is, am I familiar with the hymnal Voices Found?
Right. The hymnal Voices Found is an official supplement of the Episcopal Hymnal of 1982, and it's hymns by women, women poets or women musicians. And so it's a mixture, and it's also interfaith, and it's a very interesting collection of hymns. It came out 20 years ago. And one of the categories, if you will, are 19th century hymns by women. And they tend to be texts, as you can imagine, of these sort of gated, almost cloistered women with their circumscribed lifestyles, a very passive lifestyle, you know, depending on Jesus and, you know, my life is in your hands. How do you deal with that in terms of the texts or the culture of passivity?
I think that's a really interesting question, actually, and one that came out when I was giving a talk last week, when people in hymns, it's very tempting to view people in a passive sense. And I think there are some very powerful hymns by women, obviously, but it is difficult with this passivity. And I think there is one, I think across hymnody, the idea of just simply sitting and expecting to get rather than taking out and giving. And one of the most interesting texts, actually not by a woman, by Sydney Carter, One More Step Along the World I Go. I don't know whether you have that one here, but it's a text, it does not actually mention Christ or the work of Christ at all, but it's a real imperative to get out there and get going. And so I think it's really interesting that a text, it needs to have some sort of moral truth there inscribed. But this idea of just sitting, it's not going to take us anywhere. So it's an interesting point, and one that I shall have to think more about. Any more points or questions? Janet's got something.
Thank you. It's really to take that further, and thank you very much for the question. Thank you very much for a really fascinating talk that's leading us on into this. There's a continuous danger that we regard texts by women as more passive than they are. And I think, in case in point, is Take My Life and Let It Be, Consecrated Lord to Thee, which sung to St. Bees, sort of takes it, I've heard it talked of as a very passive text, but it's the only hymn that mentions the intellect. Yes, so a hymn that says, take my intellect and use every power as thou shalt choose. And it's actually, if you take it away from St. Bees and stop thinking about it as a woman's text, it's a very active text.
One sort of add-on to that story, though, is I've been at a group where it was sung in sections, men and women, and the men got to sing the Take My Intellect, because the women obviously didn't have any intellect of their own, so it can cut both ways.
But that's what I mean, that the 21st century congregation continues. It's not. I mean, I agree with you that the texts are there are texts that are very passive texts, but we keep the mythology going. We do things like that. And
yes.
I've got to say, I've written about this in my book. This Is Our Song. So.
Well, perhaps we should just add that as well as the perhaps women writers who we've been mentioning, there were also women translators. And I think of someone like Catherine Winkworth, who's hugely talented, immense work, and her work is still sung today. And many of the German texts that are still preserved are preserved because of what Catherine did. So there is another aspect of women's work.
Yeah, and certainly the Bronte sisters who wrote marvellous hymns, and that wonderful hymn by Anne Bronte. And now I'm on the spot. The first line has gone out of my head completely.
Me too.
It'll come back to me in a minute. But it's a song. It really is a hymn of, unfortunately, I'm ill. But if I wasn't ill, I would go on to do this, and this.
Exactly.
Oh, it came back and then it's gone.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm not much help.
I hoped that with the brave and strong, that's the first line. I hope that. Is there anything from our online community?
Yes, there is. All right, here we go. From, sorry, Linda Olin. She says, I'm interested to note that the term, quote, Lord, was used in hymn text that seemed to have the speaker's approval, yet she spoke against the sort of colonialist prejudices that some consider, quote, Lord, to embody. So what are your thoughts on the word Lord, I guess is the question.
I do find it difficult, and there are a lot of texts with this sort of Lord and also King. That's another one that comes in, and it's very difficult to work out. I'm trying to think of a specific. Does she mention a specific text?
No.
No. I know a lot of hymn writers, particularly our fine 21st century hymn writers such as Janet Wotton and also Fred Kahn, Brian Wren, Elizabeth Cosnett, they are rewriting their hymns. Fred Kahn, in his more recent hymns, or he went back over his work and changed many of his hymns, so they didn't include a certainty, particularly of a male deity or a superior male deity. One of the real dangers I mentioned in my presentation about keeping a hymn book for a long time is if you keep a hymn book for a long time, then you keep singing the words that have been sort of set out a while ago. And this doesn't allow even hymn writers who want to rewrite their texts to have them fully recognised as new texts in their own right. It's a very difficult question, changing hymns, particularly hymns that are very well known. And I write a lot about that in my book, Vintage Hymns. It's really difficult. Particularly because of rhyming schemes, but more because hymns are so well loved that it's difficult to change them. So I'm sorry that probably doesn't answer your question very well, but it gives a few more things to think about. Yes, Nancy. Hang on, wait for their mic.
I got stuck on passivism, passiveness, passive women, passive whatever. And what came to mind is Julian of Norwich.
Yes.
Now, she's, in a great way, very passive. I mean, she doesn't move. She doesn't leave her room. She doesn't leave her house. But yet her faith is very active. I'm not really trying to say anything. I'm just trying to put this out about what is passive and are we judgmental when we look at, and I agree with you about everything that you're saying, but this is just another facet of it.
Another strand, yes.
I think we need to be careful when we throw the baby out with the bathwater or something, so to speak. That God of concrete, God of steel, I remember when that came out. And my family just laughed hysterically over it.
Sorry, what was the?
God of concrete, God of steel, which
yes.
it's off the subject, but we got used to it.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm real big on judgmentalism this week.
I think I hear what you're saying, that a faith, it's faith in action, isn't it? So faith in action is not the same as action. So and people who maybe lack other capacity, particularly older people maybe who can't go out into the community, what they can do is they can pray. And, you know, that's a strong powerhouse. And with nuns and people who live in close communities, they are praying for us, and that is a power, and a power to be reckoned with. So I think that's thank you for raising that.
That's a good point. Also, somebody asked me once, they were decrying nuns and why nuns existed and that sort of thing, and what did they do anyway, because they don't do anything. And the only thing that came to mind was, well, they pray for us. They pray for the world. And that has to be active.
That has to, yes. Yeah, and we are Christians after all, and prayer is supposed to be our central.
They also teach a lot and create a lot of scholarship.
Yes, we do.
I am just sitting here listening to all this, and I think, you know, we sort of have many different lines we're taking. You know, there's so many different topics that you covered. You know, I mean, the one is the images. Like, I mean, we don't have milk bottle tops, and,
Yeah.
you know, and obviously a lot of those things aren't even things we haven't had since I was 4 or something. But there's that whole image, and then there's the whole image, the whole issue of language. You know, and those are sort of two separate things.
They are, yes.
Because we have lots of, I mean, our Methodist hymnal is 1988, so it's like, what, 30, you know, getting on 35 years old, and obviously it has dated stuff in it.
Yeah.
And you try to do supplements, but you don't want to get rid of the old hymns, but there's things in them. So I'm thinking like maybe you sort of talk about it in worship. You know.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I was talking about this at a meal earlier. Well, it can only have been today, but it feels as if we've been here for months. Is if we could only treat hymns in a sense, almost like we treat the Bible, have hymn studies.
Interpretive.
Like Bible studies. But of course, we couldn't do that in the church service necessarily unless we decided to devote one. We do have, sometimes we have sort of like songs of praise, but they tend to just be sing your favourite hymn, sing your favourite hymn, sing your favourite hymn. Whereas if we could really study a hymn, then it would be very valuable. And maybe look at hymns that have changed over several hymn books, and that we know different versions of it, and one version is good for some people and one version is good for others, and we could seek to justify those images. So I think more hymn study, which is what we need from the Hymn Society, of course.
Yeah.
In what you're talking about with all the texts and our speaker this morning talking about tunes, I was struck by the Fred Kahn piece out of the care homes, where the tune it was set to, it would be the more familiar, "The King of Love, My Shepherd Is," which has some of those questionable images or things. But by selecting that tune, Fred is tapping into all of the associated memories of the care and comfort of the 23rd Psalm for those who know the 23rd Psalm and know that hymn. It wouldn't have the same associated memories for the Hindu families and others who would come, but it's a way of preserving the emotion of those old tunes or old texts while giving very good and wonderful and appropriate new language for it.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it from that point of view, but so it's a way of keeping our heritage.
The same along that line, back to God of Concrete, God of Steel in the States. That was set to what we know as For the Beauty of the Earth, to Dix. So for the beauty of God of concrete, God of steel, God of pylon, God of... And it's the same kind of image that you just said, or up front, is we have this for the beauty of the earth, which is for the glory of the skies and all that, but yet...
Real contrast, yeah.
But for a British audience, for a British audience, of course, that would have association with Epiphany, as with gladness, men of old.
Right, yeah.
So we have to be careful, don't we, about our associations,
yes,
what we choose.
Yes. What are we associating ourselves with? Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.